The 206 bones that make up the human skeleton are actually dynamic organs that give our bodies the structure and support necessary to stand, walk, and breathe. They cradle and support the body's softer organs, serve as the site for blood cell formation, and even complete a remarkable process of self-repair when injured, called bone remodeling. As a healthcare professional, it's very important for you to know bone anatomy and understand the critical process of bone remodeling because many of your elderly patients will experience bone-related diseases such as osteoporosis. Osteoporosis affects the process of bone remodeling. The skeleton of a patient with osteoporosis may become so fragile that something as simple as stepping off a curb can cause a bone to break or fracture. This knowledge is critical so that you are able to discuss the prevention and treatment of osteoporosis with your patients. For instance, a common misperception among patients is that decreased bone density is a reason to avoid exercise. In fact, exercise in addition to nutritional supplements is a very important element in the treatment of osteoporosis. Patients who walk regularly and do lightweight strength training are actually able to increase their bone mass. By having a solid knowledge of the bone anatomy and the process of bone remodeling, you can educate your patients on the proper treatment of osteoporosis and other diseases affecting the bones.
If we're going to talk about the skeletal system, we have to start at the beginning. Because the skeletal system is not just bones, but it's cartilage that's involved also in the making of the skeletal system. So we all start, obviously, it's this precious little embryo. And initially, before we have bones, we are a cartilage model. So what's going to happen is the cartilage is going to go through mitosis and grow. And then eventually we're going to replace the cartilage with bone. So we're going to have some special cells that are going to come in and create the substances that make bone, which in the end is going to kind of, for lack of a better word, kill off, almost suffocate the cartilage. But it's okay because the cartilage is great at doing this multiplication. And then we're going to make it a less pliable, more rigid substance, bone. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the cartilage. So this, we talked about there's different kinds of cartilages in lab, but very briefly, because we only really looked at hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common cartilage. And then we also have fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. We're going to address that in this chapter. So cartilage doesn't have blood vessels or nerves. If you eat chicken, you're familiar with cartilage because it's the shiny, smooth ends of the bones, of the long bones of the chicken that you have nibbled on. And when it tears or breaks or whatever, it doesn't have vessels running through it, so it doesn't bleed. It's going to get its nutrients from areas around it. Very similar to epithelium, dense regular connective tissue. Around cartilage is a very fine layer of connective tissue called perichondrium. We're going to see this around the bone too. It's going to be periosteum because chondrium is bone, chondro bone, chondro cartilage, osteo bone. It's a very fine layer, just like we would think of the serous membranes, except this is going to be the connective tissue base. It's not going to be epithelial based. So here, this perichondrium does have the blood vessels that are going to give the cartilage the nutrients that it needs. Cartilage, you already know from your lab, is got a bunch of, well, not a bunch, but it has chondrocytes. And they're going to be living in a lacuna, and there's lots of extracellular stuff. So it does firm up, but initially when it's made, it's pretty gooey like a gel. So here we go. Hyaline cartilage, the most common kind of cartilage. I have what, 5 asterisks up there because all 3 of them are going to be on your exam. I think they're all worthy of test material. So hyaline cartilage is the one that you've met. It's got lots of collagen. That's why it's kind of a pinkish background. Collagen is the most abundant protein in your body. And it's going to be that little embryo that you just saw. That's going to be hyaline cartilage. It's also going to be at the edges of your ribs. It's going to be at the ends of your long bones. Well, most of any bone that's got some articulation to it. So articulation is where bones meet up. They articulate. They join. Your larynx, so your voice box, is going to be hyaline cartilage. You saw in your trachea, that's the samples that we gave you in both mastering and in your lab book. That's a trachea. So the rings of the trachea are made of hyaline cartilage, and then your nose tip is actually hyaline cartilage. E, elastic cartilage. E, ear. E, epiglottis. Epiglottis is this little flap that's going to protect your airway from food going down your trachea. So it looks like a tongue, and you'll see it in more detail in AMP2, but it's this actual piece of elastic cartilage that's kind of flapped up, and when we swallow our food, it covers the trachea area. So it's called covers the glottis, which is the hole, the pathway that's going down to your airway, so that the food goes down the other tube, your esophagus. And we've all been where we are laughing and talking and eating and blah, 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 and some food sneaks down, starting to go down the wrong pathway, and you start all that business. Okay, that is maybe a mild passageway trying to get through to the epiglottis, and we're going to cough all that back up. So maybe the epiglottis didn't get the nerve signal to flatten down because you're eating, but you're also talking, and you're also laughing, and you're doing all these things. Talking and laughing requires air. So you're going to confuse that epiglottis as to what he's going to be doing. Fibrocartilage, this is going to be thicker collagen, very strong. It's between your vertebrae, so those intervertebral discs are mostly fibrocartilage. The meniscus in the knee, we're going to meet those this section. They tear sometimes. Sometimes it's just wear and tear from age. Sometimes it's sports, but they are often torn with the cruciate ligaments or the collateral ligaments. There's one place not listed on here that I would like to take note of, and that is the fibrocartilage between your pubic bones. So where the pubis comes together, the pubis symphysis, it's going to be a fibrocartilage there. And when we take that, your pelvis is kind of like a box. So every time you take a step or whatever, you're shifting that box. And we don't want the box to break. And in fact, usually if you have an accident and you fracture your pelvis, it's probably going to break in 3 different places because of the way that it is, because of its box shape. So that's not on your test, but that's just those that are interested in medicine. And then, so that little cushion that's between where the 2 pubic symphysis come together, it's also fibrocartilage. You go for a jog, you're really jarring the box, but it's okay because we've got just the tiniest little bit of give because it's not bone to bone. Each os coxa is not connected to each other by a bone. It's connected right there by fibrocartilage. And then we have joints in the back also where the spine meets the pelvis. So for whatever reason, on this slide, it actually does point out that we've got fibrocartilage here at the pubic symphysis, but it didn't point it out on the slide. on the previous slide. Okay, I'm going to touch on this a little bit more in bone growth, but repetition is key to learning. Cartilage grows in a very similar way in that if it's going to grow in width, that's going to be appositional cartilage, and we're going to have where the perichondrium is laying down cartilage on the outside, making that cartilage surface wider. So if you can imagine the perichondrium is this wrap around the cartilage, if we have some cells inside the perichondrium laying down new cartilage, well, then it's making that cartilage surface area wider. Interstitial growth is what's going to help it expand almost like in length. So inside the cartilage that already exists, there's going to be some chondrocytes that are going through division. Okay, bone. So we've done this in chapter 1. I'm not going to harp on this, but please review this slide. We did this in the very first part of both lecture and lab. So let's go into a few more details. Hemopoiesis, more perfectly hematopoiesis, it's making all the blood cells. It's making red cells, white cells, and platelets. So this right here on the left is the big slide, just as you would see it underneath a microscope. And then on these different areas on the right, the smaller pictures, the things that are highlighted in blue have the names of them written on top. So on the one that's mostly blue, it says erythrocytes on top. It's highlighting the red blood cells. Another name for a red blood cell is an erythrocyte. Then underneath that, it says neutrophils, and it's highlighting 2 cells. Neutrophils are just one type of white blood cell that we have. And then platelets are very tiny. They're actually a piece of a cell called a megakaryocyte. That's AP2 material, but platelets are going to be tiny because like we took that megakaryocyte and shredded it. And those pieces are actually scattered all over the slide, but they're tiny. So almost tiny little blue dots. On kind of the bottom right side of the platelet slide, there's a cluster of them. And platelets do, when you draw blood, they have a tendency to want to buddy up. We don't want them buddying up in the blood usually, unless you have a boo-boo, right? Because they're going to help us clot. But once you pull blood out of a body, it does have a tendency to clump. They really like each other once it's been pulled out. Okay, there's 206 bones in the skeleton, and that's in general. We'll point out in lab sesamoid bones, how they can differ. But we're going to divide our bones into 2 major groups. So the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So when you think of an appendage, it's something coming off of something big. So your limbs are appendages. Both upper and lower limbs are appendages. And we're going to have a girdle attaching those limbs. So you have a shoulder girdle, right? You have your shoulder blade, you know about that one, but the whole thing is going to be called the scapula. And then you have a clavicle. So that's going to be your shoulder girdle. And then your legs are attached to your pelvis. So your pelvis is the pelvic girdle that's attaching your lower limbs. We have different kinds of bones. We mentioned these in lab, and I put at the bottom one that your textbook didn't mention, but we did mention in lab. So we have long bones that in general are longer than they're wide. This is the doggy bone, the one that you think of that you would draw a cartoon bone. Short bones are more cube-shaped, and sesamoids are listed separate in your lab book because they're very special type of short bones. They are kinds of bones that are going to form within a tendon. This is the one that I was talking about that can vary per person. So we say that there's 206 bones, but those sesamoids specifically can be different in different people. The one that we all have is the patella in common. So your kneecap is your patella. That's a sesamoid bone because it's actually sitting inside your quadriceps tendon. Flat bones have a tendency to be flat. That's how they get their name. They also form differently, and we'll get into that later. Irregular bones are weird. They don't really fit the long bone, the short bone, the flat bone shape. They're going to have weird, funky shapes. And for the most part, we're going to see a bunch of them in the skull, but also your vertebrae are weird shape. Yes, they're cubish, but they got things sticking off of them. And then your pelvis, your hip bones are also an irregular shape. Oops, and I forgot to say Wormian bone. So Wormian bones are actually these tiny little islands of bone during formation where the skull bones come together by a suture. And when we're growing, we need that suture to stay open. So that's actually going to be a type of fibrous joint. Eventually, your skull bones are going to be done growing and then they'll fuse. But sometimes little teeny tiny islands don't make it into the bones. They'll be their own tiny little bone, and they'll be called Wormian bones. You can see it in some people. Not everybody have Wormian bones, and it's usually going to be at the lambdoid suture in the back of the skull. So bones are alive. They are the organ of the skeletal system, and they have different tissue types. Lots of blood, lots of connective tissue, and quite a bit of nervous tissue. Now, blood vessels are going to be able to dilate and constrict because it has smooth muscle in it. So that's where the smooth muscle comes from. And then even epithelial tissue. So every blood vessel is lined with endothelium. So it doesn't matter how big the vessel is, even the aorta is lined with a simple squamous epithelium called endothelium. But because there's, like, say, the aorta, because it's so big, it doesn't do the absorption, right? His job is different. His job is to make sure that blood gets out of the heart and to different areas of the body. But he does have epithelium on the inside lining him. So overall, we have this hard bone that you've already looked at called compact bone. So when you think of the bone that you saw in the connective tissue section of lab, all those little big circles are osteons. And of course, inside each osteon is smaller rings. That's lamella, right? And you met the osteocyte and the canaliculi, blah, 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 blah. So another name for that compact bone is lamellar bone because it gets laid down in rings. Sometimes it's called dense bone. Sometimes it's called cortical bone. I don't know why it has all these different names. I'm not in charge. But the cortex, whenever you hear cortex, you should think outermost because we're going to do different organs, especially more in AP2, that we'll talk about the cortex, the outer part, and the medulla, the inside part. Towards the end of this class, we're going to introduce the adrenal medulla because he is nervous tissue instead of glandular tissue, which is weird and probably more information than you want at this point in AMP1. But you're going to meet a cortex and a medulla later. Okay, so that's compact bone. Then we have spongy bone, which looks like, if you cut through a sponge, that's what it looks like. And we have these fine, easily breakable pieces of bone that have been laid down, and there's holes in the middle of them. So those tiny little thin web of bone is called trabecular bone. In between trabecular bone, usually we're going to have some red bone marrow, sometimes yellow. So here's a picture of a long bone. This is a femur. So up here, I'm going to draw right here because repetition is key to learning. This is the head of the femur. This right here is going to be the neck of the femur. And this right here is the greater trochanter. We're going to have a lesser trochanter, but because this is a cross section and it's a two-dimensional picture, you should refer to my lab video for that. But look how on the outside of this bone here, we have compact bone right there. And this is where you would see if we cut through this right here and made a histology slide of that, that's where you'd see those osteons that you saw in the lab section, the connective tissue section where you saw bone and you saw all those osteons with the rings inside of it, the lamellar rings and the Haversian canal, blah, 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 blah. Now, at the ends of these long bones is where you're going to have some spongy bone. And so each of these little spikes that are in here, so I'll try and follow one, coming up like this. These little spikes like this are all trabeculae. And that's how it gets its name, trabecular bone. The darker areas like this are air pockets. Okay, short, irregular, and flat bones are going to be like spongy bone sandwiches. It's going to have an outside that is cortical bone, and the inside is going to be like what you just saw. So a bunch of that trabecular bone. I mentioned earlier that just like this cartilage is going to have perichondrium, well, bone is going to have periosteum. One thing I didn't mention is that on the inside of compact bone, we're going to have another liner called endosteum. And we've got different things going on both sides of those. When we see long bone, you're going to see a medullary cavity, a bone marrow cavity. And in short bones, irregular bones, flat bones, you're not going to see like this tunnel, this cavity. It's just all those little hole places that I mentioned is where the marrow is going to be shoved into those tiny little spaces. If it's an area where bone meets bone and it's a movable joint, then we're going to have hyaline cartilage on the outside ends of the bones. But if it's not a movable joint that's meeting the end of a bone, then it might be something else. So here's a picture of that spongy bone sandwich, and this in particular is a flat bone. So here, right here, we have compact bone, cortical bone, and also here at the bottom, compact bone, cortical bone, dense bone, whatever you want to call it. And then this right here is the sandwiched area, the spongy bone sandwich. Okay, long bones are those doggy bones that I was talking about. One thing I want to point out here is that we say long bones are longer than they are wide. And in fact, if you look at your pinky bone, the very tip of it is still a long bone. But in fact, it's quite tiny. So it's classified as a long bone because usually long bones are going to be your appendicular bones. But it's not that long. So the long bone, the part that you would like grab, let's say you're a caveman and you've got a hold of a bone and you got your hand around the middle of it, you've got a hold of the shaft, ooga booga, whatever. The ends of each of those bones are going to be epiphysis. Okay, so that you have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis for your, let's say, your humerus, your big arm bone, or like that picture that I showed you of the femur when I was showing you the trabecular bone. a few slides ago, that was the epiphyseal area that was at the head there. So not the full thing, but at the top part. The diaphysis is going to have a medullary cavity, so a tunnel where when we're growing, it's mostly red marrow, but you and I have, it's going to be filled with yellow marrow, and we'll get into the differences of those in a minute. So the epiphysis, here we go, is going to be compact bone on the outside. It's not going to be nearly as thick as like the diaphysis. And then underneath, it's going to have that spongy bone. And you're going to be able to actually see a line between the diaphysis and the epiphysis when we're adults, and it's called an epiphyseal line. So what is that? Well, as a child, it's a piece of hyaline cartilage, where hyaline cartilage is going to do interstitial growth. So the hyaline cartilage is going to go through mitosis there. When you're done growing, it's all going to be replaced by bone, and now it's just going to look like a line where it used to be. And we have pictures of that in lab. So up here, this is actually not a femur, but a humerus. So this humerus right here, this is this would be the epiphysis right here. You also have a distal epiphysis, and they haven't cut through that, so you can't see it, but you would be able to appreciate all this spongy bone right there. And then this right here is all going to be diaphysis, the shaft of the bone that the caveman I was saying would grab a hold of and go ooga booga. So on the inside, there is a cavity, a tunneling right here. And again, they don't cut all the way through, but it's going to be filled with this yellow marrow right there. This would go all the way through. So it's trying to show you that there's a tunnel, but it's filled up with this yellow stuff. So does that look familiar? Compact bone, all those little circles are called osteons. And then here on the very inside of the bone, you have endosteum. So because we have this articular cartilage right here covering that particular part, so if it's articular cartilage, that means it's fixing to articulate with another bone. If you kept going down a little ways, that cartilage would be gone, and they'd probably be labeling periosteum, which probably is the next slide, but maybe not. I don't know. No, we're going to talk about it though. Periosteum. So when you're not at the joint, when you're at a joint, it's going to be articular cartilage, but when you're not at a joint, the bone is going to be wrapped in a very thin layer of something called periosteum. And it has two parts to it. So the outer part that you could look at, let's say that you've got a chicken bone, and if you eat chicken, chicken's an easy example. You can run your thumbnail down after you're done eating all the meat off, of course. The meat's the muscle. But you're done eating that, and now you take your fingernail and you scrape down the leg bone or whatever bone. You're actually going to see like a white tissue, very fine, be peeled off. Okay, before you do that, the outer part that you're seeing is a fibrous layer, and it's a lot of collagen, dense, irregular connective tissue. But the underneath side, the deep part that's actually touching the bone itself, is where we have a bunch of cells. So not loaded up with so much. Well, it does have connective tissue. It does have collagen, but this is where the work is done. So this is where we're going to have stem cells that are busy making bone cells, and the guys that are going to end up in the end repairing tiny little boo-boos, because your bones are alive. Your bones are actually being replaced about every 7 years total. So you get from 2012 to now, your bones are essentially brand new because you're constantly, you go for a little walk and you get these tiny little fractures in your bone. And this layer right here is going to be fixing it. These cells that are in this layer are going to be fixing it. You'll notice that the periosteum is going to be where the nerve fibers are and blood vessels are that are going to course into the bone hole. So the bones have occasional little teeny tiny holes called nutrient foramen, and the vessels actually run into there, and they're going to give rise to like for example, the Haversian canal. There's blood running through that. Well, some of the vessels are going to go into those osteons. We're going to have other ones that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then that periosteum is where we're going to anchor tendons and ligaments to. On the inside, just like that osteogenic layer. So remember, Genesis, the book of Genesis is the beginning. Osteogenic is the beginning of bone. It's the beginning of bone because that's where we're going to have the cells that are going to make bone, the beginning of bone. Endosteum is going to have those osteogenic cells too, and they're lining the inside surface of the bone, and it's even going to cover those little trabeculae and line canals. Okay, hematopoietic tissue in bone. Bone is in charge of making red cells, white cells, and platelets. And where does it do that? It does it in the red marrow. So this term, I meant to unhighlight diploid because that is a term for spongy bone in flat bone. But I'm happy with just knowing spongy bone. We don't need to know fancy words for this one. Let's just stick with spongy bone. So red marrow is going to be squished into these areas of trabecular bone. Now, in a baby or a growing child, we're mostly red marrow. And what's going to happen is the body is going to change that and kind of carve it out and make a tunnel in the middle of long bones. That's not true for short bones, irregular bones, flat bones. Those are going to stay spongy bone sandwiches. But in long bones, we're going to hollow out that center so we can have some yellow marrow. We are going to keep some areas of red marrow in the long bones. So the heads of the femur and the humerus, those are going to stay. And then, of course, flat bones and irregular bones are going to keep areas of spongy bone, which is going to be red marrow as well. Now, let's say, and you'd have to be pretty severe here. Okay, we're adults. I'm telling you, we have these tunnels. These tunnels are filled with yellow marrow. If you are severely anemic, that yellow marrow can convert back to red to help you make more red bone marrow. It had to be significant. Okay, so this is actually something that we would test you on in lab, but we have lots of things sticking off of our bone. We have lots of processes, or also called projections. And different processes or projections are going to get different names. You're also going to see holes in it, and depending on how tiny or how big the holes are, you're going to have a different name for those openings. And then we're going to have these areas that are dips. Again, depending on how big or small they are, they're going to have different names. But most of the time, it's going to be called a fossa. So at that cellular layer of the periosteum, or of the endosteum, where we have these cells that are going to do the work, there's 5 total. I'm going to leave out number 4, those bone lining cells, because they're pretty uneventful and they're very similar to osteocytes. They help the osteocytes. But I'm going to do the other 4. So the other 4 types are osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. The osteogenic cells, you might see them listed as osteoprogenitor cells, but when you see gen, the book of Genesis is the beginning, so gen is the beginning of. So often they're going to be a stem cell with enzymes. For example, if you see pepsinogen, it hasn't been activated yet. So gen is the beginning, and then we're going to have a worker bee created from the gen cell. So these guys go through mitosis. They're stem cells, so they're going to go through mitosis. And they're actually going to become osteoblasts, which is another kind of cell. So these osteoblasts, these are the guys that are making what you know as bone. Osteoblasts, so they came from a osteogenic cell. Very similar to skin, osteogenic cells are going to go through mitosis. One of those cells is going to stay an osteogenic cell. The other one's going to become an osteoblast. And that osteoblast makes something called osteoid. It's a goo, and it's mostly collagen. Collagen is the most abundant protein in our body. So what's going to happen is we have all kinds of chemotaxis in our body. So chemo is chemical, taxis is movement of. And these chemicals that are inside of this goo that is called osteoid sends out a message to the minerals in your body, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and saying, hey, come here. And this goo attracts these minerals. These minerals embed in this goo, and it hardens up into what you know as bone. So the osteoblasts make this goo that's mostly collagen. I'm telling you that collagen is the most abundant protein in your body, so therefore that's the organic part. And then it attracts calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, fluoride, whatever that's in your bone. That's the inorganic part. So bone is made of organic and inorganic part. Now, sometimes what will happen is those osteoblasts secrete that goo all around themselves, and the goo hardens, and then now that poor little guy is stuck right smack dab in the middle of the goo. Now he doesn't die. He is going to mature from an osteoblast into an osteocyte. So this osteocyte is in this area surrounded by goo, and the area that he sits in is a lacuna. Remember that from lab? He's going to be the foreman of the bone. He's going to be the guy that recognizes if the bone needs help or if the body needs help, and send out messages to the other worker cells that, hey, I've got a job for you to do. So whether it's an osteocyte saying, hey, I need some of you osteoblasts to make bone, or sending a message to the last cell I'm going to talk about, the osteoclast, hey, I need you to polish up that crack. I need you to go digest that little piece of bone. And that other cell is called an osteoclast. So an osteoclast is actually not from the osteogenic cell. He is a type of macrophage. And so he's derived from the hematopoietic stem cells, right? Because macrophages are a derivative of monocyte. The monocyte's a type of white blood cell, and white blood cells are from the hematopoietic stem line in the blood. Too much information? Perhaps. A macrophage came from a monocyte. So an osteoclast did not come from that osteogenic cell. He's a unique looking guy. He has many nuclei, and his job is to break down bone. But he's a nice guy. Just like this guy from Monsters, Inc., None of those monsters were mean. They were all nice, and they were so scared of humans, but they were nice. So is the osteoclast. He has a job to do, and he's going to make sure that your bone stays healthy. So I'm going to breeze through this part because we've already done this in lab, but on compact bone, that's what you looked at, and I've already alluded to this at the very beginning. You looked at osteons and you learned the difference of all the little structures in that osteon. We did not get into the difference between interstitial and circumferential lamella, and I'm not going to ask you that in lecture, but I am on your lecture test, but I'm going to go ahead and go over it a little bit. So these osteons are the actual cylinders that you see. They run in length, and they're actually pillars. And then in each osteon is several rings, like a tree ring, called lamella. And the lamella actually is where we have these collagen fibers that are running. Each lamella has these collagen fibers running at a diagonal. The next lamella is going to run at an opposite diagonal. And so what this does is it helps that bone withstand any sort of twisting. So excellent example is the soccer player that's a forward, right? And they're running to the ball, running to the ball, running to the ball, and they plant that foot down, and then they take their other foot and they kick that ball and twist their body around. But one foot's planted. That bone doesn't get a twist fracture because of the way that collagen is laid down inside those lamella at opposite diagonals to each other to strengthen that bone. Ta-da! Like that. The central canal / eversion canal, you met that guy in lab. So I said that's where the blood vessels run through. Whenever you see a blood vessel, consider that there's also a lymphatic and a nerve fiber passing with it. I said that earlier too. When we were in lab, I mentioned that there's also another blood supply chain different from that eversion canal, and that's going to be Volkmann's canal, also known as perforating canals. These guys are at right angles to those central canals and offering to make sure that your bone gets good blood supply. This is from lab. Osteocytes sitting in a lacuna. Canaliculi are the perpendicular little tunnels that are going to the central canal, so the eversion canal, that are letting the osteocytes communicate with each other and share water, share electrolytes, whatever they need. So spongy bone doesn't have those osteons that you're used to seeing, but those trabeculi actually act like suspension bridges to help strengthen the bone, and they're going to be along stress lines. So they help the bone resist stress fractures. Very important. This is from lab and lecture. Sometimes it shows up on the lab test. It always shows up on the lecture test. I just said it. Osteoblasts make osteoid. What is osteoid? It's this goo. It's mostly collagen, and collagen is protein. It is the most abundant protein in your body. So protein is organic, right? Then there's going to be chemicals released because of that goo that attract inorganic calcium salts, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, fluoride, whatever, is going to deposit into that organic goo. Now, calcium is inorganic, okay? It's not a protein, it's not a carb, it's not a lipid. It is inorganic. So bone has both organic and inorganic components. The organic part is going to help with strength and flexibility, like I mentioned with the diagonal lines of the lamella. That allows a little bit of give with a twist. But the inorganic part helps resist compression fractures. So hopefully that bone doesn't collapse on itself from a squeeze. So organic helps protect that bone from cracking with twists. And then the inorganic helps prevent the cracking from a squeeze. So the inorganic part is what you know of that makes it hard, but they work together to allow for the full strength of a bone.